Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
It is just unfortunate to see the Houthis slapping around the U.S. in this way. It is certainly like an ill omen, but at the same time, it is incumbent upon these policymakers to figure out how to extricate themselves from this mess that they've created without simply lurching all the way into headlong retreat. The collapse of the American order is not to be wished for because it's going to be just a hot mess and a lot of Americans will suffer. So, as much as I understand folks on the right who are like, oh no, like this is great, like, get out your folding chair, sit back and watch it all melt down because tomorrow's going to be a brighter day. Well, in the grand scheme of things, that's a nice vision. But genuinely, millions and millions of Americans could just suffer all the more along the way. And it's the harder path and the less glamorous path and the less aesthetic or meme worthy path to recognize that we have to just grind out a way of disentangling the knot that the neocons and the neolibs have woven for us, and just doing the hard work of step by step getting to a better place.
Hello, and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at The American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor at The American Mind and associate editor at the Claremont Review of Books, back from a very restful, I guess I'd call it writing retreat / vacation last week. Thanks, Seth and James, for holding down the fort so ably. I am joined this week by Seth Barron, managing editor of The American Mind, James Poulos, editor of The American Mind, and Ryan Williams, publisher and president of the Claremont Institute. So, to kick us off today, we thought we would talk about the Revolt of the Kids. This is a title that I will also be giving to an upcoming feature at TAM because it describes, I think, a general trend going on the left, intergenerational trend. And specifically, we wanted to talk about this particular instance of the intergenerational tension, which was this letter that NBC got a hold of from over 40 Biden interns, so in the administration, demanding that Biden call for a permanent ceasefire in Israel. So none of this pause stuff, none of this squishy, wishy-washy, moderate ceasefire. They write, "We are Palestinian, Jewish, Arab, Muslim, Christian, Black, Asian, Latine," which I guess is like an attempt at a less cringy Latinx, white and queer. "We heed the voices of the American people and call on the administration to demand a permanent ceasefire. We are not the decision makers of today, but we aspire to be the leaders of tomorrow, and we will never forget how the pleas of the American people have been heard and thus far ignored." Two things stick out to me about that paragraph, one of which is the remarkable resemblance it bears to these kind of semi-literate manifestos and statements that are constantly issuing forth from the halls of the undergraduate academia, and the land acknowledgements or the boycott, divestment, and sanctions kind of statements that you get from that place. It's got a lot of that same rhetoric, a lot of the same cadence even. And then by the same token, this line, "We are not the decision makers of today, but we aspire to be the leaders of tomorrow." Well, there's the rub. That does seem to be exactly the point at issue. We're looking here at a growing and increasingly prominent kind of disconnect between, at least on the Israel question, although on many others, kind of an old guard establishment represented by Biden, but you might also cite Nancy Pelosi and a bunch of other figures here who have, despite whatever criticisms they may have of America and of America's wars, have always been relatively bullish on Israel and have always courted a lot of Jewish support. The Jews in America traditionally lean very Democratic. Now, the younger kind of squad era contingent are definitely rising up against that, in part through what we've been writing about on the site, which is this like Franz Fanon, like Marxist rhetoric of the oppressed. But just generally, a much more strident and radical vanguard among younger people. This is a worry electorally for Biden. A Data for Progress poll on Tuesday found that a majority of likely voters, 61%, including more than three quarters of Democrats, 76%, support the U.S. calling for a permanent ceasefire to end the violence in Gaza. There are Muslim groups also spreading the hashtag abandon Biden. So, with polls not looking great for Biden generally, there's that to contend with, besides kind of this larger trend that I've now alluded to, which is seen also, for example, in the shock and awe at those kind of wealthy, well-heeled alumni of Ivy Leagues that are now looking at the kids at Harvard, for example, who are calling for ceasefires or supporting Hamas even in all of these, signed statements that they're putting out, and saying, I'm absolutely shocked to find gambling going on in this casino. Who could have foreseen that there would be radicals on campus that may mean what they say rather than just kind of hand waving in that general direction? So a lot of billionaire donors at Harvard giving $1 to kind of protest. This guy, Bill Ackman, on Twitter, making a lot of noise about it, and just generally kind of discontent among the donors. But too little too late. It remains to be seen. Having laid the table in that respect, I'm just going to open the floor. What do you guys make of this? I assume it's not going away. What kind of resolution or ongoing tension or developments are we headed for here?
Well, it's clearly like a major problem for the Democrats. One that they like to paper over and pretend isn't happening. But, you know, we saw Bernie Sanders have a sit in his offices in the Capitol, where I guess 50 or 60, former staffers had a big protest. And I thought it was interesting. One of them stood up and was like talking about the martyrs, like,
Hmm.
the martyrs of Gaza, which just it's so discordant. I mean, nobody in America talks about it's just an alien thing to the American political discourse to talk about martyrs. Um, so yeah, that was interesting. And they're protesting Cory Booker. They're protesting all the Democrats are getting protests.
Fetterman, right, is a big.
Sure, sure. Oh, John
Yeah.
Fetterman, big time. Elizabeth Warren, they're going and bothering her during dinner. Um, and a lot of like former staffers. Uh, to me, when someone says as a former staffer,
Mhm.
it has like all the relevance of saying like as a Jew,
Hmm.
I would like to say that I am opposed to such and such. It's like, so what? Like a former staffer doesn't really doesn't carry that much moral weight. No, but it's definitely very interesting, and certainly it tells us like the whole personnel as policy question really comes to mind because any Democrat in office has a staff that is far to the left of them. You're not going to find young people going to work for Democrats who are, conservatives, like moderate Democrats. That's not who's doing it. And this is the future of the Democrat Party. These are in fact the people who are going to be elected to office, local offices, state offices, national offices in the next 10 to 20 years. Uh, so yeah, I think we're seeing like, you know, a major a major shift in that party. The Republicans have their own problems, but this isn't one of them.
Hmm. As a former pizza delivery guy, I just think that that's a very astute analysis, Seth. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, on the one hand, one shudders to think of like to the left of Elizabeth Warren, but it's absolutely true that like there are these people, at least that are true believers. I mean, a lot of this to me strikes me as we never thought anybody would take us seriously. Like many of these theses in America, maybe not so much in Europe per se, but a lot of these ideas about like decolonization and, quote unquote, liberal toleration, which means like shutting down the right, and all of this kind of like Frankfurt School stuff that has fomented in the universities for so long and that people like those of us on this podcast are fond of talking about. Like there's a kind of just insouciance and refusal to be pinned down to a lot of those postmodernist guys in academia. It's all language games and like they're not actually there's an irony to it, there's an ironic distance, whatever. And they sort of I think a lot of these professors think of themselves as in the business of sparkling repartee and fashionable cocktail parties. And it didn't really get driven home to them that what they also were like shapers of souls, and that in fact when they say things like when they put big ideas in front of young minds will like take them in like an amoeba and just totally cling to them and actually take them seriously. There's a line in I See Satan Fall Like Lightning where Rene Girard talks about Nietzsche. And he says, Nietzsche might not have intended all of this anti Semitism or whatever, but philosophers are not the only people in the world. Desperate and mad people really are all around them, and they do philosophers the worst turn of all. They take them at their word. I mean, I don't know how fair that is about toward Nietzsche or whatever. I'm not raising it to get into that, but just I think that's a pretty apt description of a lot of these people in the newsrooms, in the Democrat Party, in the professoriate, who are looking around and suddenly realizing, like, oh, they actually, this is what decolonization looks like, and they're taking it seriously.
I don't know about that, Spencer. That may have been the case in the 90s and aughts, at least on campus.
Hmm.
But I think, especially with the proliferation of administration officials, as we've seen in recent years, often in league with protesting students and the more radical members of the faculty, I think if you take that exploding admin type and then the younger faculty, I think you're describing probably the 50-year-old professors in the 90s, so they're boomers.
Oh yeah, to be clear, I'm definitely talking about
Yeah.
the Bill Ackmans and the guys that are shocked that all this is happening.
Oh, right. Yeah, you were referring to that generation. No, that's fair enough.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then the new generation, the ones who've been teaching for the last 10 years, there's the radical contingent of them in the studies and the humanities, et cetera, who really are, I mean, their purpose is to teach activism. So
Hmm.
I think this whole thing's very interesting because, yeah, the interns revolting at the White House. It's also interesting because there's our friend John Fonte has been thinking about this a lot in the last 10 years and writing about it. There's, a lot of these old Cold War institutions that were kind of pro-liberty. They call them soft power institutions, the freedom indexing places. Half of them were kind of CIA cutouts in favor of America and against the Soviets. But they were all, post Cold War, they were looking for a new meaning. It took them a while to find it. And they started to sort of turn left, especially on cultural issues. And then starting in the Obama years, kind of in league with the McCain people, especially, or the McCain types, especially when they saw the rise of Trumpist populism. A lot of these old Cold War pro-liberty, kind of Reagan era, I mean, right wing is probably too much, but anti-Soviet organizations, NGOs, and international think tank type places who weren't left wing, at least not putatively back then, have now all been co-opted in this kind of McCain type, neocon type Obama. It's all one thing. So they've kind of all signed on the Council on Foreign Relations and the various indexing organizations for liberty and all this. They're all almost marching in lockstep. They might not all be in favor of trans rights, from Budapest to Pakistan, but something like that is going on, and it was turbocharged by the rise of Trump and the rise of Trump's constituencies. So that's all very interesting. You could take, this is a little too facile, but you could take Bush's second inaugural, where he said, we can eliminate tyranny in this world. And I think the view now from this sort of set is that we can eliminate the oppression of BIPOCs in the world. And that's what's manifesting here in the conflict between Hamas and Israel. And it just drawing on what Seth's written for us at one point or another, Jews are now just white people. as far as a certain segment of the radical left is concerned. So understanding all of this in that sense is pretty interesting. Um, it's also interesting to note that you have a certain species of crusading imperialists now in these young kids. It's just on the other side, and it's all very messy because this is nothing new in a way. Our friend Angelo Codavilla, dearly departed senior fellow, used to say, and he'd like to shock people at cocktail parties or at fellowships by saying, the CIA has always been left wing. And
Hmm.
what he meant by that in the Cold War era was, the CIA did a lot of mucking about in backing various left wing movements and left wing labor movements, often in league with leftist labor leaders in America. And the argument was you need to co op all these movements abroad before the Soviets get a hold of them. So, we're willing to tolerate various forms of pro labor leftism and even sort of soft socialism abroad. If it's aligned against the Soviets, and take it piece by piece, maybe sometimes it's a good idea, probably most often not. And then you wrap it all up with the anti-colonialist movement, which came up and rose to prominence in the 60s as well. And now, so now it seems to be some weird witch's brew of all of that is animating everyone under 35, or not everyone, but a lot of the activist and public policy oriented folks under 35. And so I'll just close by saying I saw this old clip of Chris Hitchens floating around the internet the other day. I was probably 15 years old, maybe a little older. I didn't check, but he still had most of his hair. It certainly hadn't been diagnosed with cancer yet, so it's got to be at least 15 years old or 10. And his argument was about immigration in Europe, and he said, you all need to push back against this wherever you can now, before the option to push back against it is taken from you.
Hmm.
And I think in domestic policy on immigration and in foreign policy on sort of American realism, especially operating in a lot of these far flung areas of the globe, uh, whether it's the global South and the oppressed minorities in various places, or Hamas and Israel, you know, I think the window is closing for American politicians and a good portion of their constituency uh, to do something about this. And so I think the wealthy, hedge fund Harvard guy, MBA Harvard, BA Harvard, or AB, I should say, at Harvard. I think they even call their business degree something weird
Hmm.
because it's Harvard BBM or something. I forget.
BDS, I think, or that's still to come.
I have a BDS in business
Yeah,
management.
right.
Yeah, they better wake up quickly because their political constituency, even on the center left, for this sort of pushback, I think, is dwindling.
Hmm.
Um, Nothing is fated in American politics. Nothing's inevitable. So I don't mean to be too drastic about it, but with the ceaseless importation of foreigners, to riff on Mike Anton, coupled with the radicalization of the youth, and more of the faculty, um, you know, people, I think, I hope, and we've talked about this before, the silver lining of all of this horror on October 7th and the aftermath, and then now on the campuses, should I hope the silver lining, I hope, is that people finally wake up, and there can be some sort of center left, center right coalition on at least a few issues before we lose our country.
Yeah, your pushback to me earlier, Ryan, puts me in mind of the fact that, like, in my intro, I kind of presented this as, well, you have on the one hand the establishment in power who are slightly more moderate, and then in all of these like subaltern subordinate roles, you have these radicals that are chomping at the bit just to get their hands on the reins of power. And in fact, that is how these interns, for example, present themselves. But at least in academia, where usually this stuff is a couple decades kind of ahead, it's like the true believers that all the boomers are surprised about are often already in positions of pretty serious power. And in fact, are not just the students, but are the professors and the administrators and so forth. Um, I have a question for James, which is about digital kind of conditioning. It seems like a lot of these people that we are talking about as in the sort of younger set would also fall. I mean, maybe this line is a digital native line as well. And I wonder if there's anything to that. Like, do you think that these more serious revolutionaries are also represent a kind of digital era mindset that's distinct from the kind of Cold War consensus, easygoing neoliberalism or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, one of the spicier memes that circulates from time to time, the catchphrase is the woke are more correct than the mainstream. And one instance in which I can kind of make sense of that claim is on this terrain where digitally native wokies have come to the consensus that if they do not try to assert some kind of spiritual authority over technology, then they are going to be just kind of assimilated into the tech into oblivion, and have to content themselves with a sort of half life as the adjuncts of this soulless machine. Um, the religion that they have on offer to deliver them from that fate is, I think, not quite as independent of technology as they might think it to be. I think at the pinnacle, the woke religion and tech worshiping kind of converge onto the same thing. But I understand the instinct, and I understand why they're so riled up about it. Tyler Cohen had a nice post. I think it may or may not be today, depending on when this podcast is released. But he wrote up just a very little squib on the university presidents testifying before Congress, and I am going to read from a little bit of it because I think it's important. He said their entire testimony is ruled by their lawyers. He quoted Catherine Boyle over at Andreessen Horowitz. She said, "This is ruled by HR department, and it gets dark very fast." Those of us who have been banging on about the police state, pink police state, low these many years, sadly unsurprised to see that judgment come down. But going on, he says, they're all in a defensive crouch for the end goal of maintaining a kind of maximum defensibility for their positions, at that they are too skilled. And he starts asking these uncomfortable questions. How do you think that affects the quality of their other decisions, the perceptions and incentives of their subordinates? He asks the same question about how hypocritical the university policies are in free speech. Another meme phrase that we can throw in here is, it's not hypocrisy, it's hierarchy. But Tyler says, none of these universities come close to enforcing First Amendment standards for speech, even off-campus speech for their faculty, students, and affiliates. He says, what do you think about the mechanisms that led this particular equilibrium to evolve? He's a big equilibrium guy. He's always talking about people solving for the equilibrium. And he concludes, this is a dark day for American higher education. I want you to keep in mind that the incentives you saw on display rule so many other parts of the system, albeit usually invisibly. Don't forget that. These university presidents have solved for what they think is the equilibrium, and it ain't pretty. End paragraph, end blog post. This class of folks, the university presidents and their heads of HR and heads of corporations, and throughout the Borg, if I can continue to call them that, they are in a sticky situation, and I do not envy them. They created these machines. They thought that the machines would Americanize the world. You look back at the scope of history in the West, and these are the kinds of people who, they have reasons for making their smart person judgments, but look at the pattern. Oh, we had Egyptian style theocracy, and that didn't last, and we tried monarchy, and that didn't last, and aristocracy, that wasn't any good either, and oligarchy, well, we tried that, but it kind of had democracy, I don't know, all of these flawed regime forms didn't perfect a sort of artificial paradise on planet Earth, didn't succeed in uniting the globe. What's an elite to do? Where do you turn? Well, we'll just, cover the world in this sort of invisible network of innumerable little machines, and they'll do it for us. And we'll give each person one that fits in the palm of their hand, and everyone will be connected, and problem solved. Well, problem not solved. Actually, you were sowing dragon's teeth. Actually, now your own children hate you. actually now your own children hate their own genitalia, and the horse is out of the barn. This is not, you can't just like vote for Donald Trump and wokeness will go away. You can't just like, vote or try to raise up a new generation of CEOs. This is a deep-seated, widespread spiritual movement that you cannot just simply root it out of the system,
Mm.
and that is placing a real pressure on just the overarching question of, is the Constitution still strong enough and still flexible enough to respond to this crisis in a way that allows us to keep the American Republic a going concern? I think that at the end of the day, it is. Maybe that counts as a hot take now, but the Constitution is very flexible. Its strength is in its flexibility. Certainly, we're not going to be repealing any of the first 10 amendments. Quite the contrary. I think a lot of the answer here is you gotta make sure that that ordinary Americans can use these incredibly powerful digital technologies to build new institutions that are not just so hag-ridden with wokeness and its various pathologies, that they can nourish and protect the things that have made America function and function well and strengthen us in the past. But there are a lot of things that the law can't do, and the tragedy of the wokies, I really think that this is a religion that worships justice and sees perfect justice as the solution to all of our problems. And you can see it in the way that they are struggling to assert their spiritual authority over the internet by just saying, look, basically, perfect justice needs a supercomputer, so super intelligence. Can't count on mere human beings to do it. So, we wokeify the internet in America, and we all live happily ever after. I think that's just an anthropological error. You can't purify people's hearts by purifying the law. This has been a longstanding temptation in the West, and it's easy to understand why. The Biden administration is rushing headlong in just this direction. Oh, everyone stay calm. We're just going to we're going to basically nationalize the internet, nationalize digital life, make sure that it's woke enough that everyone feels like they're more or less experiencing justice in their lived experience. It's just not going to work because that's not how human beings work. If you want to have a restoration of some kind of spiritual authority over people and their use of technology, you got to go to the heart. You got to speak to the heart. You got to purify the heart. Trying to do it all by mastering the law and wringing all of the injustice and all of the moral impurity out of the law is a recipe for a theocratic catastrophe. We've seen this movie before. Every 200, 400 years, you get a different dominant communications medium. We saw what went down with the printing press. We saw what went down with television and radio. A lot of America's success in the world has been a result of the people in control with regard to those media doing relatively good things spiritually rather than relatively bad ones. A lot of what people are freaking out about today, when you look at Disney's held up as the great example of this. People in control of a very powerful medium of technological communications and using it in ways that are ultimately perverse and spiritually, nutrient free. That has consequences. So the folks who got us into this predicament by spinning up this digitized world, they're going to have a lot to answer for. But I think fundamentally, them and the wokies both just don't really understand what to do with the world that they've created. So the task falls to us to present an alternative, and I think that alternative is kind of a both and approach. On the one hand, yes, constitutionalism. Yes, making sure that whether it's at the state or the federal level, we have powerful legal frameworks in place that protect America's God-given natural rights to keep and bear these digital technologies. And on the other side, yeah, there does need to be a spiritual component. There does need to be a sort of spiritual renaissance in America that does assert a kind of authority over the use and development of technology that the law can't do, and that in a country like ours, the law shouldn't do. It's got to be both, and I think that's the bad news is that's a tall order. The good news is it's time for new institutions. It's time for a new generation of leadership, and I still think despite warts and all, we've got a lot of folks out there who can contribute to that effort and make a good go of it.
Many people are saying that only God can save us now. Thanks for that, James. Since we are talking about, among other things, since we are talking about the global American empire or the aspirants to it, I want to make sure we get in this story about the Houthis, nominally at least about the Houthis, although in fact about many other things. This, for those that need a refresher course, this is a Yemeni quote unquote resistance group. What it really is an Irani backed sort of militia. They have been firing missiles and they have drones in the sea. And those missiles and drones have made contact with 3 civilian vessels this past Sunday, getting the American Navy involved to stave them off. Separately, there was also another drone intercepted by one of our destroyers. And so these are alarming developments. You may or may not have seen them in the news. I don't know. I feel like this has been a bit buried. That's part of what I hope we'll discuss. Um, I gather from reading Politico that many people at the Department of Defense want a stronger response from Biden, want some sort of retaliation, but that the Biden administration, and I'm reading here from Politico, believe the Houthis were attempting to target assets with ties to Israel, either owned by Israeli companies or crewed by Israelis, not U.S. warships, but Houthi missiles aren't overly precise. End quote. So they're bad, lol, no big deal, I guess. Also, part of this calculus, of course, is the now extremely precarious situation in the Middle East, in no small part because of Biden's and before him Obama's sort of sweetheart feelings toward the Iranian regime, which funds people like the Houthis, as they do indeed fund Hamas as well, and train and help them in other ways. Simultaneously, it seems that the US and the UN are together trying to broker a ceasefire in another conflict between Yemeni militants and Saudi forces. So that's probably on Biden's mind or his people's mind as well. On top of the fact that just generally in the Middle East, America is now, this is not news to anybody, very entangled. And we wanted to throw into this kind of confusing and confused stew the fact of America's presence also in Syria. There have been kind of ongoing attacks on our troops there, some 900 US troops in Syria and 2,500 in Iraq have been taking fire from Iran-linked militias. So there again is the link to the Houthis, and subsequently drawing retaliatory air support, including an attack by a C-130 gunship that killed 8 members of the Kataib Hezbollah group in Iraq. So we're in Syria nominally to defend against ISIS, but the White House has said since 2021 that ISIS probably can't cause us any harm or do us any damage. So the question remains, what are we up to over there? And what should we make of all of these troubling developments among, I think it's fair to identify them as, America's enemies? Let me maybe specify the question a little bit. What the hell is going on with Biden and Iran?
Yeah, I want to have something constructive to say, but I'm rubbing the brain cells together and not a lot. We are facing a reckoning with the compounded consequences of decades of either unwise or unsuccessful foreign policy. And it's just getting to a certain point. 2001, axis of evil days. Who was the axis of evil? It was Iraq. and North Korea and Iran, I guess, right? That was the axis of evil. It was like the hardest nuts to crack. It was, we did it. We conquered the entire planet with the exception of these 3 crappy countries. And we can't really conquer North Korea. And we can't really conquer Iran. It's just too difficult, even for the world's lone superpower. Well, what is there left for us to do? It's pretty obvious. We got to just start chipping away at the last 3 places in the world where we feel like we really are not welcome at all. Okay, room for disagreement, but the logic seems pretty straightforward. So away we go. We're just going to start with the weakest link in the axis of evil. Iraq, actually pretty easy to invade. And it would have been even easier if the whip in the Turkish parliament had been able to do his job correctly. They were very close, the Turks, to legislatively authorizing the use of Turkish territory and airspace, so that the 3ID, the Third Infantry Division, could invade Iraq from the north, heading into Kurdistan. That would have really made a significant difference in, it was a very quick war by any standard, but it really would have been a lot tidier. You might remember Saddam and his sons kind of trying to scramble for a hiding place. They went north. All that nonsense would have been wrapped up much quicker, and probably with better results for the win the peace phase. But let's face it, the whole invade Iraq part was not the problem. Was not the real challenge. The challenge was, what do you do after the dog catches the car? And that was kind of the high watermark. It was all, a lot of misery and embarrassment after that moment. Iraq turned into this, really intractable mess. Afghanistan, they never managed to clear, hold, and build, or whatever it is they said was their strategy. Iran did not get weaker. In fact, it got stronger, starting within Iraq and spreading to Iran's little proxies. North Korea, Barack Obama's leaving office, and I have no reason to doubt the veracity of this account. It was widely reported, not that that means it's true, but hey, sat down with Trump and said, North Korea is going to be your biggest. This is the real crisis. Your toughest task is to figure out how to deal with North Korea. And Trump figured it out by not going to war. So North Korea doing pretty well right now, relatively speaking. Iran definitely rising, and even Iraq. They're certainly not worse off than they were during the surge. But that country, it's a stretch to say that Iraq is in America's sphere of influence at this date. And so I think it's just safe to say that the neocon neolib grand strategy of finally wiping out even the hardest cores of opposition to American global domination, that strategy has failed. Some of it was just because it was bad strategy. Some of it was because tactics were bad. This is geopolitics at the highest level. You can probably be sure that whatever your plan is, it's probably not going to work out exactly as intended. And so, I think it's less important to just kind of, haul certain figures up before the court of public opinion and pelt them with rotten vegetables, although there might be some cathartic value in that. But to just be frank about what situation we're in, and to recognize that there are sharp limits on what the United States is capable of doing right now and what it is wise to do right now. The dogs are not eating the dog food worldwide when it comes to the American official, globalized America's vision of the good life and how technology plays into it, and what sort of uh, cultural and psychological conditions go along with that. Russia, China, India, large swaths of Africa, large swaths of Latin America, even certain parts of Eastern Europe. A lot of human beings out there are simply not interested in being the next color revolution, the next stripe on the rainbow flag, the next Googleized, Amazonified prefecture of this kind of disembodied empire. And as time goes on, and the quality of life in America becomes worse for so many people, and the staying power of these kinds of hallmarks of American life that have been with us through thick and thin, as those things begin to weaken, a lot of Americans look around at foreigners and go, you know what, like, I don't like it either. I wouldn't want to be absorbed into this quasi-imperial structure. I'm looking for a way out in my own country. So increasingly, domestic policy and foreign policy in this way are interlinked, and it is just unfortunate to see the Houthis slapping around the U.S. in this way. It is certainly like an ill omen, but at the same time, it is incumbent upon these policymakers to figure out how to extricate themselves from this mess that they've created without simply lurching all the way into headlong retreat. The collapse of the American order is not to be wished for, because it's going to be just a hot mess, and a lot of Americans will suffer. So, as much as I understand folks on the right who are like, oh no, like, this is great, like, get out your folding chair, sit back and watch it all melt down because tomorrow's going to be a brighter day. Well, in the grand scheme of things, that's a nice vision. But genuinely, millions and millions of Americans could just suffer all the more along the way. And it's the harder path, and the less glamorous path, and the less aesthetic or meme worthy path to recognize that we have to just grind out a way of disentangling the knot that the neocons and the neolibs have woven for us, and just doing the hard work of step by step getting to a better place. It's got to be done.
To answer your question directly, Spencer, which is not to say that James didn't. I just reminding our listeners what prompted this. You asked what the hell is up with the U.S. and Iran. Well, it's the many ways in which the Biden administration is the third term of the Obama administration on foreign policy. I mean, a lot of the personnel are the same. There's the whole kind of DC shadow Obama operation running. It's a comms operation. It's a strategic operation. It's heavily involved in the foreign policy stuff. And so, the Obama administration wanted to pivot away from Saudi Arabia and Iraq and towards Iran in some ways. That's probably too simple, but that's kind of what was going on. The whatever the Iranian nuclear deal is called, JPOC or whatever it was part of that. The Biden administration is still trying to land that plane. And you saw it in the what I thought was, it's now seems like ancient history, but the disproportionate outrage about the Saudis murdering Khashoggi, known award-winning Washington Post journalist Khashoggi. Laughable claim for him. I mean, he's an intelligence asset of Iran, among other things. So that's all part and parcel of that. So the Iranians and the Houthis are just trying to harass us and take potshots at us while we're over there to just complicate things as we try to support Israel. I think it's pretty much as simple as that. But the wider problem is what James points to, which is our weird tick going back to the George W. Bush administration of treating foreign policy like a management problem. And it's like our approach to bureaucracy as management at home. It's messy. It's carried out incompetently. It's overbearing. It has the full weight of the federal government behind it. And it makes misstep after misstep. And its main problem, which Codavilla and others had been writing about for years for us, is the older way of doing foreign policy we just haven't done in a long time, probably even a century, at least in spirit, which is you pursue your national interest, and when you're involved in these conflicts, whether they be regional or just acute country to country, you define victory, you balance means to that end, and then you pursue it. We don't really conduct ourselves that way anymore. Um, it's kind of it's a Middle East expert management problem, and so um, I mean, I guess there's something Bismarckian and older about trying to balance the region. And that's, you see that fluctuate between Republican and Democratic administrations. The pivot to Iran under a Democratic administration is an example of that. But yeah, it's kicked up a cloud of confusions, both strategic and tactical, and that's what we've seen in operation for 2 decades at least now.
One thing that's interesting that just happened, and I don't know if anybody else has seen this report yet, but apparently an Iranian court has ruled that the U.S., having killed Qasem Soleimani a few years ago, now owes Tehran $49.7 billion in compensation, which sounds really funny, but given given the affection that and deference that the Obama, Biden, White Houses and their whole apparatus shows to Iran, who would really be that surprised if they agreed to to pay at least a partial sum in compensation? As I recall, like when Trump ordered when Qasem Soleimani was not assassinated, killed. I mean, whatever you want to call it. I do recall. I mean, Bill De Blasio, who was the mayor of New York at the time, and the entire Democratic structure, spoke about the killing of Soleimani as though, I don't know, as though they had just assassinated Prince Philip. Like
It
they'd
was
gone
as
out
if
of
he
their.
was John Walker Lint.
I mean, kind of. They really acted like that this great hero of the world had been killed, and that this was something that was just so beyond the bounds. And I remember Bill de Blasio saying, "We are now at war with Iran. You understand that? We have done something outrageous." Look, I don't really understand it. To me, it feels like in 50 years it'll turn out that Obama was an Iranian spy,
Hmm.
because how would things be different if he weren't? I don't know. I don't get it. But I just thought that was pretty interesting. $49.7 billion. Well, when the pallets of cash start flying over there,
Yeah, put it on our
expect Jake
tab, right?
yeah, expect Jake Sullivan to say, "Look, it's their money. We owe them."
Hmm.
So, I don't know.
Yeah, it's almost a reversion to our approach to the Barbary pirates in the early years when we had no navy, which is you just buy them off.
Mhm.
That there seems to be a bit of that with Iran too, but you'd think. So in that sense,
Yeah, but it's the Dane Geld. It's like, they just keep coming back.
it gets back to this problem of it's kind of an old critique. It's a critique of an old critique of realism from um, neocons and others, and they weren't totally wrong. And it goes back to Kennan's fights over the Soviet Union, which is realism is not enough. You have to really people aren't just self-interest, or countries aren't just self-interested actors in terms of sort of wealth and power politics. They have whole ideological political systems. They have regimes, and you have to understand how they think to understand what to do about them. And so I think the modern left really can't understand Islamic theocracy of various stripes, whether it be Iranian or in Afghanistan or whatever. And so it's just one other reason they blunder their way through these problems without being able to figure them out. So I think a lot of the mess, or a lot of the confusion expressed by the mess, which causes the confusion that Seth just expressed, is part of all that. So
Yeah, I mean,
we're intellectually incapable of understanding the regimes we're going up against, and we're also kind of politically, we've been corrupted by the modern bureaucratic way of doing government. And so to even to bring up what I brought up, which is pursue your national interest, pick a victory as an end and define it, and then pursue it, which is the kind of old prudential way of conducting politics, lining up your political constituencies behind that. That's all been superseded by a very different way of doing government these days, and it bleeds into the foreign policy realm as well. And it's the realm of experts in management, and the wages of those errors we're experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, that was that Malcolm Cuyunier piece that he wrote, I think, reviewing an Elbridge Colby book, maybe. We can put a link to it in the show notes. But the thing about the countries have magic, that like part of realism and being a realist is acknowledging, or should be acknowledging, that ideologies are real and religions are real and civilizations are real. And even if you don't think the people who hold those ideologies are correct, it is nevertheless a fact that they hold them. And this creates a kind of magic that either does or does not sustain a regime, guide its actions, so on and so forth. I just like this thing from the Biden admin, like, oh, we just think they want to go after anybody that's associated with the Israelis. It's like, that's us. How does that help? Like I do feel, I mean, there's definitely, as Ryan, you are ably pointing out, there's just a total like willful obtuseness or a refusal to believe in the existence of evil regimes, despite the kind of insanely moralizing and indeed almost theological tone that the elite are capable of taking in other contexts. For example, when it comes to Putin and the Ukraine war and so forth. Yeah, bad juju, and definitely something that we will probably, unfortunately, have to return to in future
Wait,
episodes.
sorry, Spencer.
Yeah.
Just because you brought up juju, I just want to flag for people. Uh,
Uh-oh.
a fun follow on Twitter is a guy named Stone Age Herbalist. He likes sort of ancient peoples and their folk ways and nomoi, etc. But he just flagged this because of Great Britain's having to accommodate itself to rapid multiculturalization. There's now the National Health Service and their kind of police units have to deal with juju, among other things. And he just flagged this one thing, which I thought was extraordinary. Somehow it missed my notice, so people should go check it out. It's so the when they're investigating human trafficking now in Great Britain, they have a lot of sex slavery that comes over from Africa in a lot of their migrants, and so they had for a while sort of juju experts, and one of the practices of juju is they've terrified these girls into not testifying against their traffickers because they conduct some juju ritual and they're terrified that if they betray them, they'll get, evil spirits. And so the British government, among its other practices now, has sort of unjuju ceremonies that they'll do with the girls and then they'll testify. I just flagged this as some weird new aspect of multiculturalism, of not just, but of the sort of sub-Saharan African and Sahel variety arriving in Great Britain. I just had to bring it up because he
Yeah.
flagged it in my mind.
Talk about factoring in the sincerity of people's wacko beliefs. I mean, that's like classic.
Yeah,
Great.
no. Look, as a pragmatic matter, if that's what it takes to get them to testify and get your sex trafficking problem down, I'm not knocking it. It's just
No, but the fact that
interesting data
report was
point.
required is kind of like in itself an indictment. And a perfect opportunity to plug a CRB piece from winter 2021 to 2022. It's called Rule Britannia. It's by the great Helen Andrews. And it's a review of Bruce Gilley's The Last Imperialist, but she goes into, at some length, the Juju murders, which kind of outline exactly what it was that Britain was up against in its stronger and more culturally confident days when they had an empire. We, as sometimes happens, we've got one more topic that we should just tease, I think, because we're going to have to leave it aside. We're running out of time. But just today it was announced that Kevin McCarthy himself announced in the Wall Street Journal that he plans to resign from Congress at year's end. This is the California district rep who, of course, was formerly Speaker of the House and then was ousted. Similarly, Patrick McHenry of North Carolina does not intend to run again. I think Ryan mentioned there may be one other resignation forthcoming. So a spate of resignations to consider and mull over until perhaps next week when we revisit it. Butterfly meme, is this realignment? ? To be continued. But for now, we must remind you all to read the damn site. We run a website. It's called AmericanMind.org. And you can find there a number of think, if I dare flatter us, really cutting edge and interesting essays and analyses of a lot of the issues that we've been talking about here, plus others. So we want to just recommend a few pieces from the site. Mine this week is called Marx in the Middle East, and it's a great opportunity for me to embarrass myself once again, as I often do, by revealing that somebody I frequently have uh, have correspondence with, and somebody that whom I admire is somebody whose name I also don't know how to say aloud. I guess it's Kevin Porteus, but maybe I'm wrong. Ryan, is that right? Kevin Porteus? Kevin Porteus?
Porteous.
There we go. All right. Kevin Porteous has written a piece called Marx in the Middle East. It's, among other things, an assessment of the Soviet roots of the decolonization mantra as applied specifically to Israel, and the innovations that Lenin came up with in the application of kind of Marxist oppressor-oppressed theory to the Jews. This is something that typically gets associated in American discourse with a kind of new left 60s and 70s turn away from economic Marxist analysis and toward quote unquote cultural Marxism. But Porteous nicely adumbrates and illustrates that this actually is not limited to spoiled American college kids, but was part and parcel of some Soviet rhetoric as well. There's lots of other good stuff in the piece, but I thought that point in particular was very interesting. Marx in the Middle East by Kevin Porteous. Go check it out. James, what do you got?
There's so much good stuff right now. It's hard to pick just one, but I think I will play to type and select Soft Occultism by Patricia Patnode. Young women looking for meaning are enchanted by a new paganism elevating ego and material desire. The photo is of some of those modern day witches you may have been hearing about on the internet. It's just a great little brief on what I think is a very real, powerful trend. Young women, women who are still young, I guess we could even say, looking for a way to be gentle and feminine in this world. Women who, for whatever reason, do not enjoy a culture or a creed or a faith or a tradition that supplies them with answers to these important questions that have stood the test of time. And so they are turning to astrology, witchcraft, occultism, and it's of course going to end in tears unless they are offered something else, something more compelling and something more real. So if you are not up to speed on these trends, it is worth the 5 minutes of your time that it will take to read Soft Occultism by Patricia Patnode.
Yeah, that's a cool piece on a cool topic, and it was surprising to me when she sent it in that like more people have been writing about that. But really good one. Seth, what do you got?
I enjoyed this piece by Aaron Zach, who's a political science professor at Baruch College. He wrote this piece promoting Iran, and I guess it's about that question that I was just talking about. Why does the Obama Biden, White House promote Iran so much? And he talks about the incoherence of this global strategy called integration that the Biden White House and the Obama White House have been pushing, and he says it has nothing to do with the entire history of great power practice, and he breaks down like why it's so incoherent and why it won't work and why it's sort of the source of the problems we're in right now. So it's a good piece, promoting Iran by Aaron Zach.
Yeah, and very germane for a lot of what we were talking about just now. Ryan, what do you got?
Yeah, I'd like to highlight a piece from really last week by David Goldman called Biden's AI Boondoggle. The Biden administration, we talked about it, I think, a couple weeks ago at least, or more. The Biden administration released at first sort of an executive summary, but now has this long executive order on what to do about AI, how to think about it. And we pointed out when we talked about it, its obsession with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and making AI, properly woke, for lack of a better term. And a lot of hand wringing about misinformation and racist AI. They didn't quite put it that way, but that's what they're talking about. And so Goldman, who's been on top of this issue for a long time, especially in his China observation stuff, talks about this. Well, I'll just read the subhead. The White House is deeply concerned that AI poses a threat to its diversity agenda. And he kind of goes through and dismantles the mess that is that executive order. And I'll just flag for people also, if you want to learn more about China and AI, just to flag for you, we did this a little abnormal for us, but David helped us put it together, and it's an interesting topic, and he gathered some interesting interlocutors, including Arthur Herman in DC. This event we put on, the Ascent of China and Artificial Intelligence. The whole thing's up on YouTube. If you just Google Ascent of China, Claremont, Artificial Intelligence, it should come right up, and you can view the whole conference. It's about 2 hours worth of video, but you can jump around, and yeah, it's very interesting and a fascinating topic. China, of course, is in many ways far ahead of us in AI, at least in its, I think, charging forward with commercial applications. I mean, a lot of the AI technology is, of course, more advanced anywhere than in the world, in the United States, through our various tech companies and the race to commercialize it in kind of creative spheres, whereas China is using it a lot more in ports and shipping and all that sort of trash management. All these mundane tasks with stuff like trucks and cranes will soon be in advanced countries run by computers, maybe overseen by one guy. So you'll have a sort of 10-to-1 people replacement ratio, but great gains in efficiency, et cetera. Anyway, the Ascent of China and Artificial Intelligence, if you're interested, go check it out.
All right. And with that, thank you all very much for listening to the Roundtable. We will sign off by inviting you to learn more about all of our various projects at the Claremont Institute, not just AmericanMind.org, but also our sister and flagship publication, the Claremont Review of Books, which I mentioned earlier. It's at ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com. Just put up a brand spanking new issue. The somewhat, I think, late beginning and arriving late. I forget exactly how Milton puts it, but it's no the worse for wear for all that. ClaremontReviewBooks.com. Go subscribe so that you can get the Dead Tree version as well as get behind the online paywall. If you want to learn more about our projects, you can visit our DC-based center at dc.claremont.org, and you can donate to support us at claremont.org/donate. We greatly appreciate everything that anyone kicks our way. It's how we keep the lights on. And it also helps if you rate, review, share, and subscribe this show. You can give us 5 stars wherever you're currently listening. You can keep whatever negative opinions you have to yourself. You can text the group chat about us or tweet about us /post on X do an Instagram thing about how Spotify reveals that we are your top podcast, or any number of other related activities. All enormously appreciated. Thanks very much to our production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Logan Zeppieri. And thanks to you all for listening. We will talk to you next week.